we're back from our trip in Asia, and the first stop in Asia was Korea, and I'm excited to have Kirby back on My Home is Special. Kirby, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I am great. We had a really fantastic time in Korea. First of all, it was colder than I thought, and you warned me before the trip because
Yep,
my dumbass wasn't looking at the map and realizing that it's about the same weather in Chicago.
yep. Because like Korea has like four seasons, just like Chicago, and then yeah, Chicago is like more windy than compared to Korea.
So luckily we realized it before we left. We were in Southeast Asia after Korea, so we had 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but Korea was like 20s and 30s every day. So
I
we did a lot more inside. We went to a couple of museums. We went to the War Museum and the Cultural Museums and just had a really neat time learning about the history. So we had a great time walking around despite the weather. And the part of the city that we're in, Myeongdong, had basically a night market, and they had all these food vendors out every night. And I don't usually do street food, but I did try some of the snacks and the sweets on the street, and it was really, really good.
what type of snacks y'all like tried?
They had like a pastry that was filled with a red bean paste.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. Like a brownish, like flower shaped
Yeah,
thing.
we tried those. We didn't try any of the octopus or squid
Oh,
or shrimp on the street,
oh
but
wow.
we had a really good time walking around and just it was quite a spectacle. And surprisingly, that part of Seoul reminded me of like New York City with
Right.
all the neon lights and the stores going into the night. It was really amazing.
Yeah, actually, I visited a couple of months ago, and then I actually said that to my friend. Like, it literally just looked the same as like the street in Korea, especially K Town. It's like literally just like copy paste of Seoul, like downtown and everything.
So I do have to share one of the impressions that we had, and my wife actually noticed it before I did, was that people were really stylish. And I know that you are a stylist, Kirby the Stylist on Instagram. I don't want to overgeneralize, but I was surprised at like how underdressed I felt. Not like super formal, wasn't like business attire, but people looked like they were getting ready for a modeling session everywhere we turned.
I feel like considering the neighborhood that you guys are staying, like Myeongdong, it's like quite like a like super fashionable neighborhood. There are a lot of office like fashion designer studio or artist studio or art galleries and then model agencies and all that. So I think that also like part of the reason why you guys felt like oh we were kind of like underdressed and whatever.
있는 게 좀 정보가 존재하고 한국 문화재청이 주관하는 부분이라서 메이크업 분들이 외출 후기를 진행하고 차례시는
I definitely would have done more if it wasn't so cold outside. The other thing that stood out to me about Seoul and the places we were seeing was just how many robots we saw running around. Like we saw a robot in the airport to help people with their luggage. The
Uh,
restaurant at the
that's
hotel had a robot like bussing tables. You know, you put the stuff on the robot and the robot would bring it back to the kitchen. And I just felt
uh,
like we saw that more in Korea than we normally see anyplace else. It was really surprising.
Well, I don't know. It's quite eerie to me. I don't know because I need that human connection that like all this like machines is going around. But I don't know. But that's very interesting.
But
So
it was part the robots, and we saw some of those, you know, in the city, in the airport, at the hotel. But even like the little hole in the wall restaurants we were going to, you walk in and there's a kiosk that you order from, and it allows you to order in multiple
uh,
languages, and you don't have to interact with people necessarily. Especially
wow,
for us, it was helpful because we didn't speak the language. But it was just
right.
interesting that you'd walk into a place where here it might be cash only, and there not only is it not cash only, but it's like super amped up on technology and the way you can order, and then you just grab a seat and they know to bring it to you. It was really cool, but it was surprising in some ways to us. So one of the things that you mentioned when we talked a few months ago was the market, and we
Right.
did make it over to the market.
Yeah, yeah, I know. You sent me the photo of it with the sign on the top of it, right?
Yep, and I
Yeah.
didn't realize it was so close to where we were staying. So we walked over actually twice, and it was really cool. Like you can buy pretty much everything that you would want. The way you described it, I thought it would be like a smaller market with some small vendors. This place was huge, and it had everything from electronics to clothes to food to fast
Right.
food to
Yep.
street food. Like it just had everything there. We ended up spending the first week of our trip in Korea, and we spent about 5 days in Seoul, 4 or 5 days in Seoul, and then got out to Jeju Island and just really enjoyed the country. And your insight on getting out into the different neighborhoods and seeing different parts of the country than just I'll say the fancy district in Seoul that we were staying in. We did get out a little bit and get away from the city. We got out to the DMZ, we got to Jeju Island, we got to other parts of the city proper as we went to different museums and tried to see different sites. And it was just really awesome. So I just wanted to thank you for sharing a little bit on the front end of the trip and reconnecting with me on the way back. Hopefully we will connect again soon here in Chicago, or maybe even over in Korea one of these days. But thanks so much for sharing about your home. It was a great trip, and I'm really grateful.
Yeah, absolutely. I am glad to hear that you guys enjoy the trip.
문화재청 국립유적 본부가 주최하고 한국문화재청이 주관하는
So we're going to kick off the recap episodes for Asia with where we started in Asia, Korea. And with that, I want to welcome Taylor back to My Home is Special for these recap episodes.
What's up, Keith? Thank you so much for having me back. I am so excited to be here again.
All right, let's do it.
So I personally watch a lot of K-dramas. And my question is, do the neighborhoods and the streets look how they do in the shows? Like how they're so different during like the night and day? And does everybody look like they belong in a K-drama?
It's funny you would say that because I don't watch any K-dramas, although I've watched some of the reality shows out of Korea. I think there's the Physical 100 or something like that. But
Yeah.
we got out into the neighborhoods, and I would say from my wife's reaction, yes. People were particularly fashionable, and it was wild because it was freezing there, Taylor, and people wouldn't wear hats, presumably because they didn't want to mess up their hair. The makeup was always done. The clothes were always tight, and I felt like a bum because I had my traveling gear on. And yeah, everywhere we went, people were just classy, and I'm sure that's a broad brush to paint a huge city on, but it did stand out to us, and we kind of noticed, we're like, wow, we're kind of underdressed to be here.
Where exactly in the city did you get to visit? What neighborhoods?
So our neighborhood was in, I believe it's pronounced Myeongdong, and we stayed there, and it felt a lot like the Magnificent Mile here in Chicago. Very cosmopolitan, bright lights, neon everywhere, people everywhere, fashionable stores. At night, there was this night market. It was crowded, the food, the smells. Everything in that area felt a little more upscale than a lot of the places we typically hang out when we're traveling. I would also add that it turned out our hotel was 1 block from our office in Korea. So I did get to walk by the office and sort of take a selfie with no intention of going upstairs and doing any work while I was there.
That's actually really cool. And me and you have talked a little bit about this. I know that you were having some visa trouble and that you were going to try to get it figured out in Korea. Did you get it figured out?
What I figured out was that I couldn't get my visa as quickly as I wanted for a future trip because I didn't have time. They wanted me to mail my passport, and I need my passport because I was going to Asia in a few days. So I figured I would just roll by the embassy that this country had in Korea. They told me no by email, but I went anyway, and I got told no in person. But the good news is it did get us out of that one area in the city, and because we got there during lunchtime, we had 90 minutes to walk around this neighborhood as well, which, again, it was freezing, so that wasn't as romantic or as idealistic as it might sound. But we actually did enjoy seeing a different part of the city. It was a quieter part of the city. There were a few like art galleries and museums, but like we did in South America, it was great to just get out of the touristy areas and just walk around and see how people are living their lives.
Last question, favorite night market food that you got to try?
I get sick almost everywhere we go, so I'm not a big street food person, although on this trip to Asia, we certainly did take part in a lot of street food. They had these like pastry kind of things. They were making them in what looked like a waffle iron filled with like a red bean paste. And I've had those before, and I had that pretty much every night we were in Seoul. They're just really tasty. They come right out of this waffle iron thing, and I was a fan. And one place was actually making them with croissants. So it was almost like a cronut kind of thing, but filled with this sweet red bean paste. And man, I was crushing those every day.
I've seen those in the K-dramas. That sounds delicious. So we can't talk about South Korea without at least mentioning North Korea. I'm sure that knowing you visited some museums and got to learn a little bit about the history. How do they discuss the history and relationship with North Korea?
It's a good question. We did spend a fair amount of time in museums, and this whole trip, all we kept thinking about was, man, world history in my schooling growing up definitely did not cover world history because we knew very little about the region. We did visit the National Museum and the War Museum, and it talked about Korea's long, long, long history. And I was surprised by how much war has just taken place on the peninsula. Like most places, there's war and conflicts that define their history, but it was interesting for us to just see sort of the different regimes and the different leaders that they had throughout their long military history and to understand exactly what was going on as best we could understand with the Korean War and how the peninsula got split. And it was interesting in a way that I didn't expect. At one point, though, Taylor, I admit, I was wandering through a museum and we spent way more time than we normally spend in a museum. And I remember thinking, wow, they just define their entire history by the different wars and the different wars that were going on. And then I realized I was actually in the War History Museum, which probably made a little bit more sense. But it was really fascinating because there's hundreds and well over 1,000 years of documented history on the peninsula. And it was just really great to take a minute and learn about it in a way that I hadn't prior to this visit.
For North Korea, and I know they have the demilitarized zone, were you able to visit that at all?
Really interesting that you bring that up. So we had an opportunity to take a tour to the DMZ and we booked it and we were like, let's do this. And I don't usually do like big bus tours, but it just seemed like the way to do it. And we had a great guide and everybody on the bus was super cool. And we took the drive up to the DMZ and we spent a really interesting day at the border, seeing the way they talk about the relationship with North Korea behind the War History Museum's point of view. And honestly, it was really interesting to see the propaganda as an outsider. I'm not Korean, and so I can sort of come in arguably as a neutral third party and sort of look at how they're talking about things. And they position North Korea as a threat to the world, not just South Korea. Every sentence seems to be comma, and that's why the whole world should be concerned about what they're doing in North Korea. For me, it was, again, really informative to understand how it came about. And I think there was a story on Vice maybe 10 years ago with Dennis Rodman's visit, and they sent a camera crew into North Korea and gave you some visibility into what life is like over there. But you can actually go in the DMZ. You're not allowed to film certain things, although I did take a lot of pictures. But they have like this observation center set up, and you can go up there. They sort of point out what's going on. And they show this building that was in the DMZ that one of the Korean leaders decided to just blow up, and it's just sort of sitting there. And then there's this town that they set up right along the border, but it's just a propaganda town. There's nobody actually living there in North Korea. It just looks like a town. But then if you look over to the other side, you actually can see there's a border town in North Korea right on the DMZ. And with the binoculars they had set up, you can actually just see people living their lives and walking around in this town, which was really bizarre because it's like they're not animals at a zoo, but people would just sort of come and look at the North Koreans through the binoculars. But it was really interesting for us to go and see that there's still like tension right there. And they had closed down parts of the DMZ because a few weeks prior to our visit, that U.S. soldier joined a tour and then ran across the border into North Korea and spent a few weeks like held captive there. Although I guess if you run across the border to North Korea, you're not really held captive. You sort of went. And so they were sort of on heightened alert because of that. But going there was really fascinating.
Overall, what was the vibe or feeling of the tour?
The tour was really interesting because on the South Korea side and in the DMZ, which I believe is an area that's run by the UN, so it's technically not in either country, there's a lot of talk about the things that North Korea did in the conflict. And at one point, they talked about these tunnels. Apparently, when it was set up and they sort of had this armed standoff at the DMZ, North Korea was actively tunneling underneath to invade South Korea. And they discovered one of these tunnels because something happened. Everybody was like, what the heck was that? And then they looked and they're like, wait, why is there a tunnel here? And there's sort of 3 or 4 tunnels that they're aware of, and one of them is actually open. And so you sort of descend down this long hallway, and they bring you to this giant tunnel. And you can look and see they sort of sealed it off so you can't get in there anymore. But it was just really fascinating that while they're sort of doing all the diplomatic things and sort of saying, okay, you stay on your side, I'll stay on my side, and the UN is there saying, okay, both of you behave, North Korea is actively digging tunnels to invade South Korea as that's all going on. But it was fascinating. There's like a little garden down there and all kinds of crazy stuff.
I'm sorry, is North Korea El Chapoing South Korea?
100%. 100%. And it sounds like they believe they're still doing it today, and they just keep finding like other little tunnels. It's really wild.
Of course, North Korea.
But it was neat to go see, because I don't think I've ever seen anything like that in any of the places we've been. And so I'm really glad that we were able to make that part of the trip happen. And it was just outside the norm, outside of the glitz and glamour of the Times Square atmosphere in Seoul and the museums and the fashion and walking around the town trying food and going to different restaurants. You then go to this thing where they're basically still at war with North Korea. They never actually signed anything to end the war, so they're still at war. And to visit a place where they're at a war posture was just fascinating and a little bit bizarre in some sense for a vacation.
That's interesting to say that they're still at war. I didn't even think about that. And I'm wondering, is even some of the stuff like K-pop and K-dramas a form of propaganda that they're pushing out to keep us from thinking about the fact that they're still at war?
Maybe. And we saw K-pop later in our trip, ironically. But one of my friends who's Korean here in the U.S. had said, it's a different kind of place to visit, because whether it was China or Japan or whoever was fighting and occupying them at the time, they really tried to erase Korean culture. And so there was this sense that she was sharing that we don't really have a culture of our own because they spent so long trying to erase Korean culture from the map. And so it is interesting that, this generation and now we sort of think of Korea as exporting all of these culture things through K-drama and K-pop and all this other stuff. And I do the hip-hop photography that I do. There's like a ton of really, really talented Korean dancers that I've met over the last decade or so. But to her, she was describing it in a way that it sounded like that was a new thing for them to define culture in Korea a certain way, which is really interesting to me. And we didn't get a chance to dig into that as much as I would have liked, but it was neat to see all of those things emerging in real time as we sort of toured around the country.
There are some famous places in K-dramas that couples and people alike visit all the time. Did you get to visit any of the islands or the famous places, like the certain museums, stuff that you see and quote unquote what we know as Korean culture?
I should probably say, Taylor, that I had been to Seoul, I think once or twice for work. So Korea was on the list of places I kind of wanted to spend more time, but it wasn't super high on my list. It was a great stopping point to get acclimated to the time zones. On the other hand, Tasha watches a ton of K-dramas. And she watches them with the subtitles because she's like, I need to hear their voices while I watch this. And that was one of the biggest reasons I wanted to spend time in Seoul. But she was adamant that we have to go to Jeju Island, which apparently is the Martha's Vineyard spot in all of these K-dramas. And mind you, I've never heard of it. But she was like, we've got to go there. And so, yeah, we booked a ticket and went to Jeju Island and spent a couple nights there.
I appreciate Tasha so much, and the fact that she just gets it, that you have to go to Jeju Island. I already know that because you went there, and knowing a little bit about K-dramas, there's a lot of like amusement parks and waterfalls and stuff like that. And did you get to see that? What was the feel of Jeju Island? Does it look like the K-dramas?
It was a really great spot on the trip to visit. So I want to be really clear that I'm really glad that we took the time to get out of Seoul, which is a massive, massive city, and go to Jeju Island. It felt more like a resort space, right? It was like going to the Estancia in Argentina, where we got outside the city and it was a very different pace of life. So we flew. We didn't take the ferry or anything like that. So we flew down there.
Oh.
So it was like an hour and a half flight, I think. And we checked into a hotel. Now, I wasn't really paying attention, but our hotel was at like this convention center, had a mall attached to it. We check in and they give us free amusement park tickets. And we're like, who the hell's going to the amusement park? It's freezing outside. It was like 25, 30 degrees Fahrenheit. However, I'm not one to waste free stuff. And so we went to the amusement park, Taylor, and I was sick and I wasn't feeling great. And I spent the 2 weeks between these trips home sick. And then you and I went out in Chicago and I lost my voice. So I spent the first 5 days in Korea with no voice. And I wasn't feeling great, but I was like, well, let's go to the amusement park. So we go and it's empty and it looks like there's nothing happening there. But we look and there's like some families there and they're bringing kids. And I'm like, I love my sons, but at no point would I take them to an amusement park in this weather. So we got on one roller coaster and I was like, yeah, it's freezing. I took a picture in front of it so we could say we were there. And then we went back to the hotel. But it was interesting to sort of see this resort space that I imagine if you're visiting Jeju Island, our hotel is rocking. There's a giant upscale mall attached to it. The amusement park's right out back. And there's like an outdoor mall restaurant area. And it would have been amazing if it hadn't been freezing outside.
That's why it is important to look up the weather. You just reminded me I should probably look up the weather before I start visiting places.
No, that said though, Taylor, we did have a day to tour the island, and we found a driver who would take us to all the sites, and we saw like spectacular waterfalls and parks and sculptures, and we went to this market that was really, really cool. And going to markets is one of the things we do in almost every country because it gives you a sense of how people are living and what types of foods and how they interact with each other. And you see people, again, just going about their daily lives at the market. And Jeju Island was really awesome for that. Like, it was just a really neat place to see a different side of Korea than we saw with all the high-tech glitz and glamour of Seoul.
Well, now it's time for my personal favorite part, the story. And I'm sure you have a really good one because there's so much to see and so much to do in Korea. So what is the story that you would share on the stage at Grown Folks about Korea?
I spent a lot of time thinking about that, Taylor, and it's definitely a grown folks story. At least the attachment on the website is for grown folks. You know, on our last day in Jeju, we booked that tour that I told you about, and we felt like it was the best way to see everything. We didn't really know what everything was, so we went through our book and through the websites to try and figure out what was going on, and we saw this place called Loveland. And we're like, oh, that's interesting. What's Loveland? And it's
no.
Oh, wait a minute. It's Loveland. I'm like, okay. Who doesn't love their neighbor? And as we're looking at this thing, it's basically an outdoor erotic art museum. And when we went to the art museum in Peru, there was a whole section of like erotic Inca art. And I have some pictures on the website, but there's just no other way to describe it. It's like, wow, they were getting down back in ancient times. And when we saw this on Jeju Island, we were like, well, there's no way we're going to pass this up because we got to see how they would interpret an outdoor erotic art museum. When we booked the driver, he had his itinerary, and we were like, actually, we need to go to Loveland sometime during the day. After a week in a very proper feeling South Korea, we get out to Loveland, and it basically had larger than life statues of people in wild sex positions and poses. And many of the statues were of people like wearing masks and had like a comical kind of depiction of sex and what they were doing with these sex acts. When I say larger than life, Taylor, I mean, these are statues of people getting it on that are like 10, 11 feet tall. I mean, just like giant erotic statues. And there were dozens of them spread out over the property. And we walked around the whole day and took pictures. They had some interactive exhibits where you can sort of turn the crank and the statues move. And I gotta say, based on what we had seen up to that point in the trip, and this was our last day in the country of Korea, this was not what I expected.
It's interesting because I have actually seen pictures of Loveland, and I thought it was fake at first. I thought it was like the first AI pictures to ever hit the internet. No, knowing that it is real, but to have someone that's gone there it's kind of mind-blowing because, like you said, Korea comes off as such a proper formal country, and then to have this. But I do know that Korea has a little bit of an underbelly, and so I guess you can kind of see that a little bit in this museum, right?
Yeah, and look, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. We went to one city and one island in a reasonably large country, but touring this museum, yeah, I mean, we went to the gift shop towards the end, and it was basically a sex toy shop. And inside the building, it had a few more statues and a bunch of dioramas of different scenes. It was like cutting a cross-section of a hotel or a classroom or an office building. And in every room in the diorama, people were just getting it on. And what I learned afterwards, because when we got back, I was like, okay, wait, I got to go to Wikipedia and read up on what we just saw today. Because, you know, the market was nice, the waterfall was nice, but you're kind of like, wait, what was that? What was concerning or surprising to me, or shouldn't have been surprising to me, was the controversy that surrounds that exhibit. I learned that some of the depictions in the dioramas, and a few of the statues actually, which I did notice, depict what I'll say is questionable behavior, peeping toms, or what could be viewed as sexual assault. And it was an interesting visit, and the interactive exhibits were cool, but it was one of those things where you realize, like, oh, it's not just erotic art for the sake of erotic art and being provocative, but it also spurred some really interesting conversation about what was acceptable behavior, especially some of the things where, peeping tom is not okay, right? Sexual assault is not okay. And although some of the exhibits were certainly there for shock value, I think they also spurred some important conversations. That said, I did take a lot of pictures. I made it a point to take a picture of every statue that we saw. And so there is a gallery on the website. You probably shouldn't open it at work. But if you want to see what we're talking about, I put it all there. And I'll leave it at this. When you go someplace, see all of the places you visit. Visiting Loveland made South Korea feel very different from the proper urban, uptight impression that we had. And if we had just sort of stayed on the beaten path, we never would have seen that and never rounded out a full perspective of South Korean society. And I'm really glad we did it. It was unlike anything I had seen before.
I think that's a really important point for anyone that's looking to travel and really take traveling seriously. Get off the beaten path at least once.
Definitely. And Korea was a really great stop. I will add this, Taylor, in closing from me. One of the things that was special is we had a bunch of really good meals in Korea. And I'll be honest with you, if you've ever gone to Mexico, like, the Mexican food in Mexico isn't nearly as good as the Mexican food here, which is blasphemous to say. And the Chinese food in China was not as good as the Chinese food here. And that's definitely betraying myself as probably a very biased American who likes the American twist on those foods. However, prior to this trip, I really was not a fan of Korean food, and I've tried it several times. I will say the Korean food in Korea was outstanding, and we threw down at every meal, and I am a huge fan of what we had when I was there, and I look forward to finding a restaurant here that can match the authenticity and the flavors that we had when we were there.
I think our takeaway is that now we have to go on a hunt for the best Korean food in Chicago.
I'm here for it, Taylor. Let's make it happen.
Let's make it happen. Thank you, Keith, so much for allowing me to be a part of this amazing discussion and just this amazing story. And I'm looking forward to the next episodes because, of course, we have more coming. And I'm looking forward to talking about Cambodia. Yeah, let's talk about Cambodia next.
Thanks for listening to this episode of My Home is Special. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you get future episodes automatically. Go to myhomeisspecial.com for the occasional email update too. That's where links to photo galleries and a few other surprises will live. Be sure to follow KBev Photo on Instagram for behind-the-scenes footage during our journey, and it'll be in the stories. If you just want the photos, go to kbevphoto.com. There's a lot else on there to explore. For now, this is Keith, aka KBev, signing off. Peace.